An EU democracy shield to fend off Russian influence, a migration pact testing political nerves, and a fresh plan to save European artists. Some of the stories shaping Brussels this week. Welcome to Brussels, My Love, the podcast with me, Maeve McMahon. For our second ever episode, I'm thrilled to be joined here in our studio by Garvan Walsh, the chair of Unhack Democracy, a Brussels-based election watchdog and pro-democracy NGO. Welcome, Garvan.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. We're also joined by Stefan Krobbe, Euronews' political correspondent, a familiar face on Euronews since the 90s. Welcome, Stefan, again.
Thank you for having me, Maeve.
And joining us from Brussels as she makes her way over to the European Parliament, where a mini plenary session is taking place, is Helena Hahn, migration policy expert from the European Policy Centre. That's an independent, not-for-profit think tank, very well known here in the EU capital. Helena, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
How are you all? How's your week been? Garvan?
Yeah, it's been busy. A bit of a intense week on the democracy front with the Democracy Shield, all these things being launched. It's crazy things happening in the United States as well that are distracting us.
At least the government shutdown seems to be coming to an end.
Yeah, but then now we've got the Epstein files coming out, so that's...
We do. A lot to keep an eye on. Did anyone take Tuesday off?
I did. It
was a bank holiday.
Yes. I was at Paradisa, the world's best zoo.
Lucky you.
About an hour from Brussels, and it was worth the trip. The weather was nice, and then, you come back and that's it.
Well, it's funny because Tuesday in Belgium was, of course, a bank holiday to mark the armistice, the 11th of November 1918, which ended World War I. But the Commission also chose that day to hold a press conference on one of the most political, divisive portfolios on their desk. And that is, of course, the EU Migration Pact. We saw the Austrian Commissioner, Magnus Brunner, speaking to the press about that pact that, of course, came about back in December 2023 and is meant to come into effect on the 1st of July 2026. Helena Hahn, we'll lean on you for this story. Fill us in here. What is the state of play on the rollout of this migration pact?
Right. So indeed, it was a little bit sneaky of the Commission to choose to make such an important move on a public holiday, because it left not just myself, but probably many others kind of scrambling to read all the documents that were released. But in short, we're now kind of in the second half of a 2-year implementation period of the pact reform. So indeed, they will begin to fully apply in mid-2026. And that means that there have been a lot of efforts, but also a lot of pressure on member states to make the necessary adjustments in order to meet all the new rules and requirements. And what the Commission has done or did earlier this week was release what is so-called an annual report on the state of migration and asylum in Europe. And that is meant to be a sort of fact-based, evidence-based assessment of the situation from which the Commission derives an assessment of which member states may be in need of solidarity or additional support. And as many listeners will probably know, solidarity and responsibility over asylum seekers, as before, remain sort of the tricky and crucial and sensitive components of the pact reforms, precisely because they are a very political matter. At the end of the day, this is about how member states will agree to step in and support each other when arrival numbers or other factors such as strained reception conditions, etc., fall into place.
And that's the thing, as you say, this pact is highly political, Garvan. I don't see it really working here if it's kind of a pay your way out kind of scheme.
Well, I mean, this is always the problem. I mean, particularly the problem with the people who are driving the agenda on this, which is obviously the far right. But the thing is, they tend to be nationalists, and then they tend not to cooperate with each other. They have different national interests here. Italy wants to send them elsewhere because it's a border state. It's receiving a lot of the migrants. Hungary isn't a border state at the moment, so it doesn't want them anywhere near it. These are fundamental contradictions. And they're always going to play a role here, and they're always going to lead to a level of dysfunctional policy.
Stefan, your view on this?
This is a story, of course, that is preoccupying us for a very long time, and I don't see the migration pact, the latest edition, as a practical way forward. Well, to begin with, there are 4 hardline countries that have already challenged the whole thing, saying they would not cooperate. That's Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, I think. And here it all starts. So I think at the end of the day, we will see that member states will act only based on their own national interest. And the EU Commission is praising and stressing the word solidarity. But this is probably the biggest stretch here, kind of telling people, yes, there is solidarity, but in fact, there is not. So I don't think that politically this is a very practical instrument. This is the least possible sort of compromise that they were able to strike. But we'll see. Right now, the numbers are down of refugees. If really we're heading into another crisis, I don't see this pact being a solution to this problem.
And on the numbers, you mentioned the numbers. Yeah, I was reading the Frontex figures this week. Irregular entries have gone down, irregular entries into the European Union by 22% in the first 10 months of 2025. But as Garvin pointed out, this is highly political. And Helena Hahn, we've seen a change of tone as well in the debate. I mean, the Progressives didn't do well in the European Parliament elections last year, and this is the consequence. We're seeing a much right European Parliament.
I think, yes. I mean, as with many other kind of political files, the pact very much represents a compromise. And in some cases, perhaps also kind of a, least common denominator. I think what we have seen instead is kind of moving from perhaps on the more sort of center left and progressive forces within the European Parliament, perhaps of resistance or opposition to certain components of the pact, to saying, well, okay, if this is a legislation that we will have in place, we need to focus on implementation. And this is, of course, where the problems really lie. This requires massive financial investments. It requires a lot of political will. And it also requires, and I think this is kind of one of the key ingredients, trust among member states. And just to give you an example, so in response or ahead of the publication of the report, Belgium and the Netherlands issued a letter to the Commission saying that we acknowledge that this new solidarity mechanism in place and that there is a process leading up to it that will define which member states should benefit, who should contribute, and what kind of pledges we can expect. But for us, it is really important that the Dublin rules, so those rules regarding who has responsibility over asylum seekers, that they must be respected in order for solidarity to actually function. There's a lot of elements that are not necessarily new, but that could give rise to further political debates. And I'm not so sure if or how exactly, far right or extreme right parties will respond to this, because they tend to reject the pact altogether.
Keyword there, isn't it, is trust among member states. I mean, member states don't really trust each other.
They don't.
Well, not on this issue.
No. And they sort of they imagine that immigration policy is something that's dealt with by border control, and it's not. It's really got to do with labor markets. It's got to do with qualifications. Got to do with asylum treaties. There's much more going on than just trying to put like a fence around Europe. Many irregular migrants are visa overstayers. There are a whole series of other questions, and probably only. On the centre-right side, only the Greek government has actually tried to actually expose this as an issue and have a discussion. And for its pains, it's now facing 2 or 3 far-right parties to its right, rivaling it. This is a very difficult political issue and no obvious solutions.
Well, the irony, if I may, the irony is that we need migration. We as Western societies in Europe, we need migration in order to keep up with our living standards, with our social security systems, etc., etc. A country like Germany,
especially Germany, right?
The biggest economy on the continent needs, according to scientific data, roughly 250,000 people every year to keep that level of security and prosperity. Now, where should these people come from? Well, sometimes we want Syrian doctors. Sometimes we want African mechanics. I don't know. It's really, really difficult. But now we're shooting ourselves in the foot by having a system in place that, as you say, is basically building a fence around Europe. On the other hand, we all know the political problems. People are not happy. One country after the other has seen a rise of extreme right-wing extremists campaigning on this migration issue, and that is a problem. And I don't know the answer, but this migration pact here is certainly not the answer.
I think people are very unhappy with the disorder associated with large migration flows rather than the migration as such. If people come for economic reasons, if they assimilate into the economy in general, people often don't even notice those migrants coming, and they're quite happy to adapt to them. But this sense of loss of control is quite serious for public.
Yeah, no, I think this is an important point because that also, I would say, oftentimes gets lost in public debates, which is that you end up in a kind of very binary situation, which is, you might read sort of public polls or surveys and they suggest that, people either are for immigration or against immigration. But when you try to narrow it down or break it down a little bit more, it becomes a lot more about what kind of migration are people receptive to and more willing to accept, as opposed to what kinds of measures would they oppose. And I think that's where, if politicians speak of kind of a total loss of control, the situation is out of hand, it doesn't necessarily reflect what people actually think, because I think we all kind of have an innate sense of, we would like safety and security. We in the end don't want chaos. But as Garvin was saying, right, a lot of this kind of safe and orderly migration doesn't necessarily get visibility. And that's also a good thing, because it means, or it suggests rather, that integration measures and support works. But I think there are quite a lot of screws that could be turned when it comes to enabling people who are already here to integrate into societies and labor markets.
Integration, of course, is key. Just briefly, Helena, negotiations are ongoing in the Parliament there on the EU's proposal for return regulation. What's the state of play of that?
The Danish presidency at the moment already kind of suggested, well, we might be looking at a joint position in the council by the end of the year. But as we know, there's always back and forth between the council and the parliament. And so I'm not too sure we can really count on an agreement within the next eight months. But I think we can certainly expect a lot of pressure from all sides on the legislators.
So that will be, of course, something for the Irish presidencies to pick up. They'll be in the spotlight as of July next year. But let's continue our conversation, because there was a lot going on, of course, in Brussels this week. And another story we're looking at was the presentation of the EU Democracy Shield, with social media and deepfakes and disinformation on the rise. The idea here is to counter this. Euronews reporter Romain Armengau was covering the story for us, and she sent us this update.
Disinformation is on the rise, and elections in the EU are especially targeted. We saw, for example, last year, Romanian presidential election getting cancelled after a report of Russian destabilization campaigns on TikTok. So the Commission tried to fight back, and they came up with a plan they called the Democracy Shield, which is sort of a list of recommendations on how to secure election and better protect democracy in general. The main element of this is the creation of what they called a European Center for Democratic Resilience. It's basically a hub that will put together expertise of member states in identifying, but also fight back on disinformation. I talked with Nathalie Loiseau. She's the member of the European Parliament who heads the Democracy Shield Committee.
We definitely need a democracy shield, because democracy in Europe is not just threatened from time to time, it's attacked daily. So we need it. The Commission has come with a communication. It came late and it's still shy. It has to be bolder and it has to come with concrete measures.
That was, of course, Nathalie Loiseau, the French MEP, being interviewed by Romain, our reporter. Now, Garvin, it is your turn to shine here on Brussels, My Love, the podcast, because this, of course, is your topic. You've been waiting for this Democracy Shield for a long time. What's your take on it?
Well, I mean, it's a good start. It's important that the EU is taking this threat seriously, because we've been facing a concerted campaign of Russian subversion, not just hybrid attacks, not just disinformation, but really subversion at all levels, because Russia wants to divide European countries from each other. It knows it's bigger than any single European country, but smaller than us when we act together by a long way. So it's trying to do as much as it can to divide us, do as much as it can to pollute our information environment, and to cooperate with nationalist forces within Europe that are either happy to align themselves with Russia or in many cases have received money from the Kremlin.
Stefan, your view here, could this be a game changer in the fight against Russian meddling?
I'm not sure. I don't want to be too cynical here during
it's
this.
Hard to be optimistic.
Conversation. I mean, I've experts who have looked into this have said that the Europeans are once again caving to American pressure. And I don't know whether this is true, but we're for quite some time struggling to tame the big US tech companies who basically refuse to play along and make sure that this sort of disinformation is not happening on the big social
plan, of
media
course, here.
Sites. And that's exactly the issue here. So there's not only, we're kind of sandwiched between Russian trolls and American capitalists here, right? I mean,
well, indeed, we remember the elections in Romania. The presidential elections were cancelled because of TikTok bots and foreign interference. Helena Hall, what is your view on this?
I was really thinking about kind of in what context was this democracy shield presented? Because of course there's a whole aspect of foreign interference. And here we see that, in a way, there was quite a bit of legislation in the past years with, and as Stefan was also saying, with the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's also other components to the democracy shield. So and I was wondering a bit about, there's a lot of talk about support for media and for civil society organizations in, upholding and defending and promoting democratic values. What kind of support, what kind of concrete support might we really see? We know that this is also very much linked to financial resources. And of course, the next MFF, the financial framework, so the EU budget, is still subject to negotiations. And a second aspect of this that I was also thinking about, of course, being based in Brussels, is what role is there for EU institutions themselves to address the risk, or rather the threat of foreign interference? This is, of course, a communication, and as Garvin was saying, kind of a good first step. But it did make me wonder a little bit about what more will come to make true on some of the ideas.
Indeed, I mean, it seems kind of like a rehash of what's already on the table. I mean, there's talk of using the AI Act to manage kind of online disinformation, and also the DSA, which is the Digital Services Act. Garvin?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, this, trying to blame it all on, American tech companies actually misses the point. Yes, they're involved. Yes, there's disinformation all over them. Yes, Elon Musk has been doing crazy things with Twitter. But in reality, this is also about the strength of European society and Europe's ability to build strong democratic institutions, especially in member states where democracy is newer. And for the last 10 or 15 years, the main funder of that activity until Trump got in was actually the United States. All that funding has been
well, that's a problem too now. Funding is so scarce.
Has been eliminated. In this proposal, there is a €9 billion pot called Agora EU that is supposed to do this. But the way the EU funds civil society and other organizations isn't always the best attuned to the way civil society works. It tends to be very centralized. It tends to be very bureaucratic. It tends to be project-based. Organizations find it hard to continue in that kind of basis. I mean, the administrative burden is very high. Many of these organizations are very small. The USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy was able to do things much better. We have the European Endowment for Democracy, but this can only operate outside the EU. Maybe it should be allowed to operate inside the EU, but that again would need negotiation with member states, and countries like Hungary are on its board. Difficult questions. How do we fix this? It's a good first step, but there are lots of obstacles.
Isn't it too little, too late?
Well, it's too little. I mean, let's just get on with it. Yeah. I mean, it's a long game, but there are many more things that can be done to strengthen, particularly when it comes to acting on infringement proceedings. That's the biggest thing. The Commission is not prosecuting violating member states fast enough. It's been pretty slow with its legal instruments. It has powers it can use against backsliding states. It hasn't really used them. We still have things like the mayor of Varna in Bulgaria still being in jail, The EU hasn't acted strongly against that kind of backsliding. It's constantly afraid, so it can't take the initiative. The rule of law needs to be upheld properly and not be subject to too much political calculation.
Yeah, just on this, I think this is also a really important point in the sense that in the past couple of years, we have seen kind of the lack of compliance with rule of law and the mechanisms or the instruments that the EU has at its disposal, that they have been used in a way more as bargaining chips or as a form of conditionality to say, well, if you want to benefit, or if you want to actually be able to access, this chunk or that chunk of the EU budget, then please make sure to, follow up on your responsibilities here, rather than kind of the European Commission also as the guardian of the treaties coming at it from a principled approach. Now, that might be wishful thinking, but in an ideal world, it wouldn't be kind of a quid pro quo, to maybe put it a little bit simply, but rather have this shared understanding of democratic values and the importance of the rule of law. So I think as much as, again, there's a big focus on foreign interference here, and that's, really important to address. But I think the conversation also needs to think about, what state is democracy at within the European Union? And at what point might you say, there has to kind of be an end to this kind of middle way of not quite tolerating, but in a way also not acting that strongly against rule of law compliance issues.
We see this in the EU, we see it in the United States, we see it in Britain. There's still too much of a business as usual feeling. People are thinking that ordinary mechanisms will work, ordinary politics will work. This has become the most serious crisis of democracy in the world since the 1930s. And we're not upping our game to deal with that kind of threat. We think we can make compromises. We have other bargains to have. But we're seeing what happens in the United States when one of these authoritarian leaders gets into power, how destructive it can be. And we need to make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen in the EU. That's why the Romanians were right to hold that election again. There was a clear violation of election expenses law here. By all means, use fake TikTok accounts, but pay for them and account for them using the proper electoral rules that you have. That was the problem there. There's constant attempts to subvert freedom and democracy and people's right to make a fair and free choice at election time. And this simply shouldn't be tolerated. And we need to recognize this for being a concentrated attempt and a concerted attempt to subvert the freedom and the rule of law and the democracy that's made Europe what it is.
Okay, and on that point, we can bring the conversation about the EU's Democracy Shield to a close. For more on that, do visit euronews.com and you can read more about that and what it means for you. But now, before we go, I would like to touch on a topic that might appeal to you if you're a singer or an artist or a poet or a filmmaker, a sector that represents 4% of the EU population. Because this week, the European Commission presented its much anticipated Culture Compass. And Stefan, you actually sat down with the youngest EU Commissioner, Glenn Michailov from Malta, to discuss this Culture Compass. Before you tell us more, let's just bring in Glenn Michailov to hear his take.
For the last 10 months, I've been speaking to stakeholders in the sector, artists, writers, publishers, and many of them, they long to dedicate themselves to their artistic work, but they can't because they don't afford it. And they feel, and this is the takeaway that I get from the consultations that I have, that we expect them to work for free, voluntarily, and without compensation. So our objective here is we're proposing an EU charter on the rights of the artist, on the status of the European artist. We want to kickstart that discussion immediately in December when we have the high-level roundtable on artists' working conditions.
Glenn Michailov there. So, I mean, when you read the headline, it looks like great news, Stefan, but in reality, will this really change the lives of struggling artists who are working precarious hours?
Once again, I hate to be a cynical here. The thing is that,
well, you're
Glenn
around for so
Michailov-
long. I mean, the more you age, the more cynical you become, right?
Oh my God! So Glenn Michailov is a nice guy. He's young. He's from a small state, and he certainly has good ideas. The thing is that the EU as an institution has no competence when it comes to culture. It's a thing that it's for the national governments, and even that is wrong. If you look at Germany, it's the regional states that have the power over culture. Of course, Michailov said, and he said that repeatedly throughout the year, I want artists to be able to pay the rent from what they're making, their artistic work. How do you do this? I mean, somebody must pay them. Then you're an employee, and then where does your artificial intelligence is not a problem?
Oh, that's another challenge facing that sector.
Where does your creativity go if somebody pays you for painting or something? I don't want to diminish that sort of work, but I think this is an inherently problematic approach. Yes, an artist should, all rules and laws and everything applies to every individual in the European Union. But the world of arts is difficult. And, history is full of famous artists, musicians, painters, writers who became millionaires decades after their death, right? And because they at their lifetime they didn't make much money. This is, I hate to say this, this is part of nature here.
Garvin, did you even manage to read the Culture Compass? I mean, it's not really something that's making the headlines in EU member states. It's more a Brussels story.
I would say that if there was one institution in the entire continent that you probably didn't want in charge of helping art and promoting creativity, it probably would be the European Commission.
Okay, we'll have to get the official reaction from Dan Michailov on that, but yeah.
The whole point of this, and it applies to civil society strategy as well. They want to coordinate everything. Whether it's someone who sets up an NGO or sets up a business or becomes an artist, they do stuff because they like doing their own thing. They're creative people. They don't like living in big structures. And you have to find ways of providing an outlet for that creativity. I mean, if you're looking at policy solutions where the EU might work, then you're really thinking about, economic incentives, tax systems, matched funding for cultural institutions in the poorer EU countries. Because, you can go and live in, I don't know, Constanza or something, and costs of living are relatively low and make a much better living as an artist than if you're living in, Hamburg.
Indeed.
So how do you encourage this European mobility so that people can take advantage of this?
Helena, your view there?
Listening to the commissioner, I was thinking that in a way where it's not so much only about the cultural sector, it's about the affordability crisis that is that is manifesting itself across member states in many different ways, be that in terms of cost of living, housing prices, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems to me a little bit like there are these underlying issues that would need to be addressed, at the very least in tandem, in order to support the cultural sector and as well as individuals working within it. I do want to add one point though, which is one of the components of the Culture Compass, which is the expected AI strategy for culture and creative sectors. And I think that is something really interesting. Again, I also have some doubts about kind of the role or the position of the European Commission in this beyond kind of looking at it from a regulatory perspective. But I mean, if you go on social media these days, you will see videos that, show you two different kinds of images or videos and, make you guess which one was created using AI versus not. And if we think more in that direction, I think that is a conversation that is already happening and certainly will need to continue happening. And so I am curious though about what a strategy could do in order to address the many very difficult, also ethical questions regarding the use of AI in culture and creative professions.
That is indeed a fascinating point, and we'll jump into the topic of AI very soon here on Brussels, My Love, the podcast. And indeed, there were so many topics under discussion this week in Brussels. There were huge votes over in the European Parliament on the climate targets for 2040 and cuts to green reporting requirements. But do keep an eye on euronews.com to get informed. But for now, thank you so much to our guests, to Garvin Walsh, Stefan Krobbe and Helena Hahn for joining us, and also those behind the scenes, to our sound technician, Yorgos Leviditis, our Euronews podcast producer, Alice Carnivali, and to Fatih Yatim and Juliana Mejia, our social media team. And if you're not already, you can listen to this series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on euronews.com or Euronews' YouTube channel. And if you like what you hear, do leave us a review. And of course, spread the word about Brussels, My Love, the podcast. See you next time.
Euronews.